Welcome to our Wednesday night Bible study. We are starting a brand new study this week looking at the book of Romans. I'm really excited to dig into it just because of the significance of the book. And on a personal level, I've never done a full verse by verse study of the entire book of Romans. So I'm really excited just on a personal level to have gone through every single verse and studied it. And the book of Romans is one of those that the more you look at it, the more powerful it is, the more impactful it is in your life. So with all that being said, let's jump into it. Going through school, my favorite subject was always history. Right? It's always been history. Like math, I did enough to get by. Writing, I did enough to get by. It's all the other classes, it was like I didn't really have a passion for them. I could do them, but they weren't my favorites. But history, like I was the kid that if it was assigned a one-page paper, it ended up being 10 just because I loved it that much. I love history. As a matter of fact, it's basically kind of how I view my job now. Like I'm all about living in the history of the Bible and putting the context of that together so we can understand the truths in our own time. I love history. It's my favorite thing. But when we went through world history growing up, I remember like we studied like the Greeks and the Romans and the Persians, and we studied Middle Ages, and we studied the Renaissance, and then we got to America. And when we got to America, one of the facts that always bothered me was that North and South America were named after a guy named Amerigo Vespucci. And naming him after him doesn't bother me. It's why him that bothers me. Because Amerigo Vespucci was kind of just like an elite in Portugal. I believe he was Italian, but he only made 2 trips to the Americas. He's the guy who, to be fair, discovered the mouth of the Amazon River. But other than that, really didn't do a whole lot. He was really more famous for being a map maker. And so it just bothered me that why would we name the Americas after this guy when he didn't really contribute a whole lot? It would make much more sense to name it after, I don't know, like Christopher Columbus, not saying we should, or Cortez, like the first guy to conquer land, or, or the rich people who funded it, like we did like Carolina and Virginia, like name it after royalty or the wealthy benefactors. Like I didn't understand why we would name it after this no-nonsense map maker guy. And so like I eventually looked up his map of the Americas, and I thought, this has got to be like this great, fantastic leap forward in map. He was alive. He made his map around the 1490s. It had to be like this cutting edge thing for the time. And to be fair, his map of the rest of the world, pretty good for that time and age. But the map of America is pretty sad. The Caribbean, the islands in the Caribbean are just as big as North and South America. He didn't really do a whole lot to contribute to our understanding of North America. But the thing is, it reveals this principle, not so much why they named Americas after him, but this principle of maps. The fewer times a place is explored, the worse the map is. We look through history, we look at the history of maps, we look at things like the Imago Mundio from the Babylonians back in the 600s BC. It's the oldest map that we have, we're pretty sure. It's kind of hard to date the oldest one because what if somebody made a map of their backyard kind of deal back then? But regardless, this is the oldest map that we all are kind of like, yeah, this is the whole world. That's what they were trying to make here, was a map of the whole world. And it's this little tablet, and it's this crude, rough drawing that's not accurate at all. Jump forward to the 150s AD, and we look at this thing called Ptolemy's Geography. And this was part of Alexander the Great's Ptolemies, if you're familiar with world history. And this guy drew a map of the world as he saw it, and it's of basically the Mediterranean basin and the ancient Near East. It's a massive leap forward, and the world had been pretty well traveled by that point, at least that part of it, to Ptolemy and his people, the people who helped him do this. But then if you jump to the Americas and we look at things like Amerigo's map in the 1490s, it's horrible, right? Like they hadn't been there very much. They didn't know a whole lot of it. Jump forward to the 1570s and we get a little bit clearer map that has a little bit more definition to it. But there's still quite a few parts wrong. 1600s, it's looking a little closer. 1700s, it's almost there. And by the 1800s, pretty much all of North America and South America had been settled. It's pretty well accurate. And then you jump to today where we don't make maps anymore. All we do is take pictures. We overlay maps on top of them. We change the colors and stuff so we can look at them better. But essentially, we don't make maps anymore. We just take pictures from the sky. Now, as you looked at all of those maps, I want you to kind of see that as the principle we're going to use for studying the book of Romans. You may have heard about the book of Romans, and you may have a picture of it in your head of what it looks like, but chances are the picture in your head, it's kind of like Amerigo's map of the Americas. You might have some features moderately similar to what it actually looks like, but chances are it's pretty far off. But maybe you've read it once or twice, or you tried to read it and it was confusing, and you're the picture in your head, it's twisted and distorted. Yeah, it is the book of Romans, but it's not exactly what it actually looks like in real life. Or maybe you've studied it a bunch of times and you're starting to get a little bit more definition to your understanding of it. You're starting to grasp it a little better. Or maybe you're somebody who's studied it for 30 years and you have a really accurate understanding. The map in your head of Romans is almost photo perfect. But the thing is, while Romans doesn't change, our lives change. And so the way we understand and apply the messages of Romans, maybe we need to take another satellite image of the book. Maybe we need to look a little bit closer to refresh our understanding of the book of Romans. That's the principle I want to use as we go through this. That no matter where you are, there's always another level of definition to our understanding of the book of Romans. And so whether you're new to this or you've been here for a while, I hope you'll stick with us as we go through this entire book and try to understand what Paul has for us. Now, before we actually study any of it, if you've got a study Bible like this one here, I want you to open it today and turn to the part at the beginning, right? It's the part where it has like when it was written and stuff like that. Not every Bible has this kind of page on it. But if you have that, open it up and we're going to talk through some of the contextual things. And the reason that we're going to do that is because we want to make sure we actually understand the message God has for us through this letter. And if we try to understand it through any other means other than the one in which it was written, the context in which it was written, how the original people would have understood it, how the original author would have intended it, then we run the risk of making the Bible say something it doesn't actually say. So today, we're not actually going to get into too many verses of the book of Romans, but instead we're going to make sure we understand the context of it so that we can have an accurate picture of what God has for us from this letter. So, that being said, anytime we read the Bible, we need to know three things as best we can about what we're reading. The first one is who wrote it, right? So who wrote the book of Romans? Well, it's Paul. And really, I'm not going to stand too long on Paul because let's be real. He's one of the most talked about people in the Bible, right? It's like Jesus and then Paul. Like they come up in almost every sermon. They should come up in almost, at least Jesus. But the author Paul, like we've heard his story, how he was raised to be a Jew amongst Jews. He was somebody who was highly intelligent. He was schooled amongst the elites. He was making his way to be in the Sanhedrin, basically. He was taught by a guy named Gamaliel, a really famous rabbi. He was a Pharisee. He was somebody who was what we consider a zealot. He was okay with violence to protect God's way of life and to keep the people of Israel within the covenant boundaries. Like he was somebody who was a type A personality. He was a go-getter. He was confrontational. He was somebody who was really wired to be the perfect kind of like modern day CEO. Like that's where Paul would end up today. He was somebody who would be great at leading a big company to go down places that are difficult because he's okay with confrontation. He's highly intelligent. He's motivated. He's a self-starter. He's that kind of guy. And, you know, again, we all know the story most likely of his conversion on the road to Damascus, where Jesus like literally knocked him off his horse and said, "You're going a new direction." And he was sent to the Gentile churches. He's an apostle, which if you're unfamiliar with the word apostle, basically it means somebody who is sent with authority. So in a sense, somebody like a police officer, they have the authority of the government behind them to enforce the law. They are sent with that authority. Jesus looked at Paul and said, "I'm sending you with my authority to share the gospel and establish these new communities amongst non-Jewish people, amongst Gentiles." And so that's Paul's vocation. That's how he sees himself. His goal in life, the mission that Jesus has given him, is to go start new communities amongst people who are far from God, who are not Jewish. So that's his mission. That's who wrote it. That's his whole ethos. That's what he's working at. And by the time he writes this letter, he's getting towards the end of his life. And we're going to talk about more of that here in a second. So the first thing we need to know is who wrote it. Well, that is Paul/Saul of Tarsus, the apostle. The second thing we need to know is who is he writing to, right? Every letter has an intended audience, whether it's meant to just be like a generic textbook written for everybody, like Ephesians meant for everybody, or something specific to a specific church, like Philippians or Colossians. So who is he writing to? Well, chances are if it's a letter of Paul's and it's got a city's name on it, it's written to that city. Again, Ephesians is kind of the exception to that. But he was writing to Roman Christians. Now, let me explain the significance of that, because it doesn't sound like what Paul normally is doing, right? He's establishing new churches, and most of his letters are either writing to churches he's established already, like he's already been there and he's following up, or it's a letter written to just kind of be a teaching letter. So why is he writing to an already established church? Well, Jewish people had a significant presence in Rome going back to the 200s BC. So after Alexander the Great conquered basically everything he stepped foot on, including Israel, eventually he died, and the people of Israel were led in rebellion by this family called the Maccabees, and they established a kingdom of Israel again. Well, the former empire of Alexander broke into pieces, and pieces of that surrounded the nation of Israel, this newly formed nation, getting their new independence under the Maccabees. And they were constantly trying to take back Israel. They were constantly at war with each other. So the Maccabees thought, hey, here's these new upstarts named Rome who are seem like they know what they're doing. They're willing to be our allies. And so the Maccabees kept sending envoys and people to Rome to establish a relationship there. If you know your history, you know that backfired, because eventually one of the Roman leaders named Pompey, he came and basically just annexed Israel. He took it over for Rome in 63 BC. And so after that, Rome started bringing a bunch of slaves back to Rome, Jewish slaves. And so there was another big influence of Jews into Rome in the 60s BC, in the 100 years before the time of Jesus. They were later freed and made citizens, and then they were given special rights by Julius Caesar and Augustus Caesar at the beginning of the first century. The Romans loved ancient things, and the Jews were ancient. You know, they had already been around for 2,000 years by that point, that we're pretty sure of, most likely even earlier than that. But they predated the Romans by a lot. And so despite the fact that Rome demanded everybody worship the emperor, starting to it at the time of Julius Caesar and Augustus Caesar, but it was beginning, it was there. And they definitely demanded people be patriotic and keep the gods happy. They gave Jews special rights where they didn't have to do that. They were able to just stay faithful to their own covenant and stay faithful to their own way of religion and their way of life, because they were so ancient. The Romans respected that so much. So what this built was a really, really vibrant and healthy population of Jewish people living in the city of Rome by the time Paul is writing this letter. Now, there definitely were some kerfuffles and some issues, especially amongst the elite Romans with the Jewish population. Emperor Claudius famously kicked out all of the Jews from Rome in 49 AD. And then when he died in 54, they were allowed back in. But I digress. For the most part, you had a really large Jewish population. And this is where most likely the church started, because you had these Jewish people who lived in Rome go back to Jerusalem for the mandatory festivals, according to the Torah, and they found Jesus. They heard about Jesus. They heard his message. They heard the stories. They most likely could go and see, like Golgotha. They could go and see the grave. They could see all of these things. They could hear people preaching in the streets of Jerusalem. And they saw Jesus was the Messiah. And so they brought back their faith to Rome and established a church there. And so Paul didn't bring the faith to Rome. Rome brought it to itself, because Rome is the center of the world, basically. Everybody goes to Rome. Everything goes to Rome at this point in history. It's the eternal city. It's the city that has connections with everywhere. I mean, we have archaeological evidence that they had connections with China during this time. Like it was everything, every faith, every religion, every belief system was present there, including Christianity. And so this is kind of like our first glimpse into why Paul is writing. He's planning on visiting, and he wants them to be ready. So who is he writing to? These already established church in Rome that is multicultural. Most likely there's a healthy Jewish population in it, and most likely there's a healthy Gentile population in it. So that's the audience. So author is Paul, audience is Roman Christians. And that gets us to the third thing we need to know. What's the agenda? What's the motivation behind writing this? Because every piece of scripture, basically anything that's written down has motivation behind it, whether it's poetry for beauty, or to tell somebody you love them, or it's a text message to tell your wife what to pick up for dinner, or it's, a giant thesis on theology. Like, you have to understand why somebody does something to truly grasp the point of it, I think. And so the letter to the Roman church was written between 55 and 58 AD, but we're pretty certain it was 56 to 57 AD. If you line up the timetable of what had to happen with the archaeological and historical record, we're pretty certain it's then. Paul is writing from a city called Cenchrea outside Corinth. So Corinth was essentially landlocked in Greece, and so there was a little port city built right next door to it on the sea, and that's where Paul is staying. He's staying there for 3 months. So, trick question for you. Who actually wrote the book of Romans? We just said Paul is the author, but who actually wrote it? Well, if you read chapter 16, verse 22, you find this. It says, I, Tertius, the scribe for this letter, greet you in the name of the Lord. So who actually physically wrote it? It was a guy named Tertius. So that tells us that Paul, during these 3 months, he has help. He has people there who are ministering to him. He's being strategic again. He's very, very smart. And he has this guy named Tertius who's dictating to write down this letter. So the guy named Tertius actually wrote Romans, even though Paul is the author. Another question, who was the first person to teach and preach Romans? Well, it wasn't Paul. It wasn't Tertius. It was actually a lady named Phoebe. Romans 16, 1-2, it says, let me introduce you to our sister Phoebe. She is a deacon in the church at Cenchrea. I want you to welcome her in the Lord, as is proper for one of God's people. Please give her whatever practical assistance she may need from you. She has been a benefactor to many people, myself included. So when a letter was delivered in the ancient world, the person who was delivering it, it was expected that they would be the one who would explain it. That they would be the one who could answer questions because the person who wrote it explained everything about it to them. So the first person to actually teach it and preach it was a lady named Phoebe. Now, here's the thing. Here's why I'm bringing this up. It's to put the context of what Paul is doing, right? Paul is not just sitting there saying, hey, I feel like writing a letter to the Romans. Like, it's not a willy-nilly thing. This is something he spent most likely months doing, and he had other people involved with it. He had other people's opinions involved with it, that he was divinely inspired to create this thing, and God wrapped Paul in the arms of people around him to make it happen. And so he's just finished the first half of his third missionary journey. He knows he has to go back to Jerusalem. He's been collecting money to aid the people in Jerusalem because there's suffering going on there and famine and whatnot. And so he's been collecting money from churches on this missionary journey. He plans to go back to Jerusalem, and then Scripture tells us in Acts that he was going to stay there for 3 months and then go to Jerusalem, and then he was going to go visit Rome on his way to Spain. That was his plans. We see in Romans 15, 23, and 24, if you want to look it up, that his plan is to visit Rome, stay, talk with them for a while, and then go on to Spain for his fourth missionary journey, which I think actually happened after his trial before the emperor, and then he was arrested again and then killed, but that's beside the point. And so this is where we start to see the agenda develop, that I think Paul has two big goals for this letter. The first goal I think he has is to provide the Roman church the gospel in advance of him getting there, right? You ever play the telephone game or see the telephone game played? You know, the thing where somebody whispers a message into somebody's ear and then that person whispers that message to the other, and you go all the way to the end after several people, and almost always the message is not what was originally shared, right? It's almost always twisted. It's almost always warped. Whether it's because people accidentally changed it or because someone who's being ornery and changed it, but it's almost never the same message as what started with. Now imagine trying to share something as complex as the gospel and all those stories about Jesus and all the teachings about Jesus and all the applications about Jesus, and none of it's written down, at least not on a wide scale. It's being shared word of mouth across an entire empire. It's going to get twisted. And Paul has seen it get twisted over and over. He saw it when he came and he helped start the church in Ephesus and grow it in southwest Turkey. Before he left, they had turned their backs on him and embraced another gospel. They had embraced a false gospel. They rejected him. They didn't have a great revival again until John showed up at the end of the first century. We see that happen all the time, even today, how something as simple as the gospel can get twisted and manipulated, that heresies happen. And we know that this happened throughout the wider church in the first, second, and third centuries. We know it did. We have records of it. We have the church fathers who fought against it. That's why in the New Testament, so many letters, especially the newer ones, all spend significant amounts of time and energy addressing false gospels. Because it was rampant, it was everywhere. Whether it was Arianism, Marcionism, it didn't matter what you look. Gnosticism, there were just all of these twisted versions of the gospel out there, and without a standard like the Bible to hold it up against, then yeah, like you don't have any way to fight back against it when somebody shows up and says, "Hey, no, this is the real version of the gospel." So I think Paul is writing the letter to Romans to really establish, hey, this is a standard you're going to hold up from this point on. This is the gospel. Now, I don't think it's meant to be like this big systematic theology where he explains everything about faith. It's not. It can't be. It's too situational, right? He addresses things specifically to Rome's situation, whether it was the difficulties with the Jewish-Gentile relations, or how God views the Jews, or all the different multicultural things. Like, we're going to talk about that in a second, but it's too situational. It's not a systematic theology. If you have seen those, they're huge. And Romans is a massive letter by first century standards, but it's still by no means a full-scale systematic theology of Paul's beliefs. I mean, there's massive topics he doesn't talk about in it. He doesn't talk about the Holy Spirit. He doesn't talk about the second coming. He doesn't talk about the church. It's very situational. So he's addressing the things he thinks that the church in Rome needs to see, needs to hear. But I think it's primarily goal number one to provide a standard. This is the gospel. Anybody who twists it is twisting it away from the truth, right? Second one, I think, is preventative pastoral care. Getting back to that thing I just said, that all of the issues that Paul has faced throughout his missionary journeys. You got to remember, he's at the middle of his third and final one that we have record of. And he's seen all these issues, whether it's people being anti-Paul, whether it's people being Judaizers saying you got to become Jewish to become a Christian, or the struggles of trying to live out your faith in a pagan society, or anti-Semitism, which was rampant amongst the Roman elites. Again, you had the whole Emperor Claudius kicking the Jews out thing that happened just 10 years prior. Or addressing the mission to both the Gentile and Jewish communities. I mean, Paul has all of these issues that he's seen throughout his travels, and all roads lead to Rome, after all. He expects to find them there. And so I think what he's doing is he's providing preventative pastoral care. He's trying to address some of the issues he thinks are present, or has heard about are present, in order so that when he does finally visit, as he intends, that they'll get the most out of their time, right? That they'll have the gospel, they'll have doctrine so they can have questions about, and some of the issues he's already addressed directly, and so he won't have to spend as much time with the pastoral care side of it. So those are our two big goals. So let me recap really quickly for everything we talked about. The first is that the author is Paul/Saul of Tarsus. It was dictated to Tertius, then delivered and taught by Phoebe, and it became the church in Rome from that point on, and thus passed down to us throughout the centuries. And the audience is the Gentile and Jewish mixed church in Rome that's already established, and his agenda is to provide a definitive gospel and to do preventative pastoral care. I'm excited about where we go from here and how we dig into this super highly influential book, and hopefully we'll both grow in our faith and have a better understanding, have a better picture of the map of Romans in our head when we're done. If you have any questions, reach out. Otherwise, we'll see you next time.